I read the best fantasy books of the last decade. I selected these books based on the impact that it had on the reading community, different lists, the awards, and also Booktube. In 2014, my favorite author released a gem, and I can confidently say that it's one of his best works. Although it did not win the Goodreads Choice Awards back then, it has now one of the highest ratings on Goodreads, and it has been rated by almost 500,000 users, and that is Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. So book 2 in the Stormlight Archive series. This chunky one, it's the favorite of a lot of readers, not only because it cemented the story and how great the characters are, but because it really has very powerful scenes, both from the perspective of how the characters are developing, also the war scenes, the fights. Although in Ways of Kings we already have an epic ending, throughout this story we get multiple very epic points, and upon a reread I was amazed on how great this story was. The death rattles, the development of Kaladin, of all the characters, it was fascinating. And although Wind and Truth has not really conquered the hearts of readers, I still believe that the journey makes sense. In 2015, we have 2 books to mention. The first one, although it's a little bit less known overall than the second one, managed to win an award 3 years in a row, which is something that has not been achieved since then. And this is the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. This series got the Hugo Award for 3 years, starting in 2015, and it did so not only because the writing style is very different, which for me is what made this story not land as good, and it's not one of my favorites. I actually found the writing style quite jarring, but the world building and the magic system and everything feels so fresh and so unique, and I really believe this is something that it's a me thing, that I did not enjoy this one, mainly because on how it is written, the second person here, and although it makes sense and it is woven, it missed the mark for me, but it's a favorite for a lot of readers. The second story that in 2015 had a ripple effect and really revolutionized a lot of what we read was A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. This author was already very well known thanks to her Throne of Glass series. However, when this one hit the market, it had an incredible effect. It not only brought a lot of readers back into reading, and it was a beautiful entry point to fantasy, but also it changed how other stories were created. And from that point onwards, we started seeing way more about the Fae, about these epic sexy scenes, and although this was originally sold as a young adult story, believe it or not, it has been consolidated as a romantasy or fantasy romance for adults. My experience with A Court of Thorns and Roses was that the first book, which is the retelling of A Beauty and the Beast, was not really great. It's a book also that the pacing, it's quite weird because it's very slow at the beginning, then the ending where epic fantasy things really start to happen, everything happens so fast, and it's a relatively short book. Book 2, it's way better in my opinion, and book 3 was also a great conclusion. I reread these a few years ago, and although I did not love them as much as I did when I read them back on the day in 2015, I can really say that it was something that got me back into reading, and I know that a lot of other readers as well. The A Court of Thorns and Roses series has sold around 13 million copies up till now. It's not only the trilogy, but expanding to the 5 books that we have right now, but nonetheless massive in terms of publishing. In 2016, we have one of my favorite authors also getting into scene. Her writing style is usually well known because she is great at creating worlds that are very imaginative, very unique, but at the same time her writing style, it's quite dark, and her main characters always has this kind of who is a monster, who isn't, and it's just, even though it is not grimdark, you can feel that there's a dark part looming there. We're talking about V. Schwab with Darker Shade of Magic. Book 2 specifically is the one that got up to the top 3 in the Goodreads Choice Awards, but book 1 is the one that had a high remark on the market. And up till now, I believe that this series is a favorite of a lot of different readers. I just recently discovered 2 years ago, and I was in love with it, not only because it has a great magic system which woves itself into the world building, and I find that it's fascinating having these different worlds, and each world has a different level of magic, and how that gets into our characters. It's kind of like a limitation that I find great, but also how the characters behave. It's a little bit of a mission, a quest with terrible villains and kind of grey main characters. For me, it was one of my favorite books 2 years back. In 2017, we have one of those stories that, although it's underrated still, and I will die on the hill that this trilogy deserves way more praise, it did win an award a year after, which was the World Fantasy Award in 2018. In this case, we have a trilogy that it's urban fantasy but blends magic and a lot of strategy and a lot of family drama, and what I consider one of my favorite series so far. Please give Greenbone Saga a try. And in 2017 we got Jade City. For me, this is something that I discovered thanks to Booktube, because a lot of different people recommended it to me well before I even had my channel, and I fall in love. I cannot convey how amazing the character work is. I think this author is a master writer, and how book 1, book 2, and book 3 progress are very different. You get to see really how this family drama evolves, and we will be following these two clans fighting for the control of the Jade, which is this element that provides people with special powers in K-Con. And although it seems that the main thing will be around the Jade, it's actually quite the opposite, and it's way more about how you can access the Jade, the power structures, how the family arranges themselves, and how they fight for the control. There's a scene in book 1 that I still have in my mind, like I if I think about it hard enough, I can still cry. In book 2 we have one as well, and in book 3 as well. Like, it's just so incredible, and it's one of those books that really change your taste in books, because it's phenomenal. Another trilogy that in 2017 really had an impact on readers, and in this case it was reflected because it was part of the Goodreads Choice Awards and it was at the top as well. It's a trilogy that blends religion with action, with fantasy, but it's a quiet and very well written story that in this case displays the pagan religion, and that is the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden. I've only read the first book, The Bird and the Nightingale. The main character is independent. She knows herself. She knows what she wants to do, and it's not a story that belongs to the pining, to the slow burn, although it has a little bit. It's more on how our character grow, and how in a world where we have a fight of religions, she is trying to get closer to the forest and to hear those voices, and how she needs to defeat a terrible danger. I love this one. I know it gets better in books 2 and 3, so I cannot wait to continue with this series. In 2018, two stories took the world by surprise. The first one started a ripple effect with the retellings. And the prose of this author is very well known because it's not purple, but it is descriptive. It is beautiful. It allows you to see the pain of our characters and how they're advancing through different situations, and it's very vividly. I've mentioned before that I have challenges imagining sometimes books, but with this one it was so beautiful, and it was surprisingly action-packed, although in reality it follows the main character since she is a child, and this is Circe, which is the story of the first witch. It's a Greek retelling, so if you are a fan of Greek mythology, you will see a lot of different characters being featured here, and I love that. And it not only won the Choice Awards, but it also has a 4.23 stars, and more than 1 million people read it, and it really displays how it had an impact, and a lot of people knows it. We know also that the Song of Achilles from the same author also had a great impact, and it's one of the favorites of a lot of people. But for me, Circe, it's a story that I will not be able to forget, so this is definitely worth your time. Another story that, although it did not win the Goodreads Choice Awards, it did have a great impact and consolidated this author as one of the most popular current fantasy female authors. It's The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This is not going to be the last time that we see from this author in this list, but The Poppy War for me was so transformative because it's the first book that I really hated. I hated the main character with burning passion. The scenes are savage. There's a retelling at some points of some Chinese very conflicting moments. So definitely check the trigger warnings, because this is a book about war, about strategy, and it's not an easy book to read, to follow, or to love. However, once you do so, it's kind of like it has made a mark on your heart, on your skin, and you cannot take away the feeling that this is incredible. It starts being a dark academia and it quickly changes to a war book, a strategy book. And the main idea is that we have this war unfolding and our character is placed at this school where she is learning, and it seems that part of the magic in this world it's being able to convey with the different gods. So they are kind of shamans in this case, and they can lend their powers. And what you will see is how these are used and how all of these are intertwined in war. Fascinating, terrible itself, and it was such a hit that was translated into a lot of different languages. In 2019 we had two stories that were completely different. One of them is a chunky that really was one of those standalones that made itself a space into the public opinion despite being quite a chunky, which I guess we fantasy lovers adore good chunky books, and for a standalone to be this chunky, just like, yes, you're going to provide something amazing for me. It was nominated as one of the Goodreads Choice Awards, and I am mentioning this award multiple times throughout this list because I do believe there's a correlation between how popular these books are outside just the internet bubble and throughout the world, and how these books are promoted. And in this case, having a standalone there, for me it was quite a rare feast, and I'm talking about The Priory of the Orange Tree. It has a beautiful book cover, which might have made it the delights of the publishing industry, and the prequel, which I haven't read it yet, it's also beautiful and it's very promising. This one had such a beautiful premise, and it is started in a way that I absolutely loved it, like the beginning, like the up till the 75% of this book, I guess I really loved, but it did not land for me. So this is not one of those that I would really sadly recommend for you. Like if you like standalones, which I adore, this is one that it's interesting, but in my opinion was not the best. It had so much promise. We have these different characters throughout the land, and we will follow their points of view, and this will allow us to see different lands, different dialects, how different people behave, even different types of magic, but reaching to the point and how they need to stop this terrible evil that it's emerging. I felt that the ending fell flat, and that actually, although it is already chunky, it should have been longer. Like things were so quick at the end that I was not able to truly falling in love with this one. The second book that in 2019 made an impact, it's still one of the weirdest books that I've read, and I love it because it's gothic, it's set in space, you have this blend of sci-fi and fantasy, but at the same time you have weird narration styles, which in this time work for me, not sadly as with the Broken Earth series. And there's a mystery at its core. We have different houses, great world building, but it is really very character driven, and this is the long-term series, in this case Gideon the Ninth. This one was a nominee for both the Hugo and the World Fantasy Award, and it's no wonder. It's a story that checks a lot of boxes, but it asks a lot of you because you're not really understanding. We have these necromancers on space, and there's these different houses. Each of these have a different type of necromancy magic, which I thought was great. I'm lately entering my dark vein in life, so I'm really enjoying this type of stories. And in here, having that idea and the very traditional tropes of, you know, the trials and mystery, it was fresh. Well, it resonated as something that I knew, and that blend really blew my mind. It's something, the humor also, it's very on point for me, but it is also kind of weird. So I guess this one is one of those that I fully recommend, but if you don't like it, I will be like, yeah, it was not for everyone. So I'm like halfway there. If you want to read it, this sounds good to you, give it a go, but it's definitely one not for everyone. In 2020 we had a revolution, especially with cozy fantasy. COVID came in, and you know, it was terrifying. It was very depressing, and it was one of the hardest times for a lot of people, which made reading, and especially reading cozy fantasy, such a great escape. And that is when in 2020 House in the Cerulean Sea was published. It was so very well acclaimed. I clearly remember myself picking it up, reading it that summer. Here in Spain we had a lockdown since March until June. We were not able to go outside from our houses, and in July we were barely able to get out to pick this book because I heard a lot of people raving about it, and people described it as being a warm hug, and I definitely needed that one. And what I found here really scratched that itch for me, and for me it was these happy tears that I found myself shedding. I recently reread these for the Patreon Book of the Month pick, and although it did not land as amazing as the first time, I still believe this book had something, and I cannot forget the moment in which this one was released. So if you want to read about great characters, especially magical children, which are really sweet, this is one for you. And the other book that was not as popular, but also this author already published another standalone before, and she was very well known back then, and she really changed things because her previous standalone was a chunky, like 1,000 pages or so, and this one was very short. It was barely, I think, 200 pages. I have here like a copy that has 200 and something, but the letters are really big, so I'm not sure. I think it's a little bit shorter. And this is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. What made this book so great is not only that was nominated by the Hugo, Nebula and Fantasy World Awards, but how this author was able to show how she can change different periods of time, how different lengths, and still make this story so unbelievably good. We will follow one of the greatest characters that I've read in my life. He is a cinnamon roll. He is very naive, and how he approaches life in this big mystery because he lives alone in this house that it's magical, and he does not understand anything, and he's trying to uncover that peril, and he's visited every now and then by this weird mystic person that it's called the Other, and together they need to figure out the magic of this house. That was fascinating. And I just recently read her previous standalone, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and I am in awe about how amazing this author writes, and it has the same flavor with a different touch to it. I mentioned this book in a video that you can see here because it really changed how I read, and it made me discover both that I love standalones, weird books, and magical realism. So if this is something that you like, give this one a go. It's one of my favorites. In 2021 we have two books that sadly I do not own, but in one hand we got this Asian inspired story which in a way reminded me to the Poppy War, and it was pitched as a Mulan retelling, which I don't really believe it's what we should be doing. And this was actually one of the first videos that I made on this channel after reading it, because I was amazed on how much anger and how many twists and turns we had, but the expectations how it was sold were really important. And this is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker-Chan. This story, it's about war, it's about strategy, and I love that. There were a lot of moments that I did not expect myself, and this was also on the top finalist for the Goodreads Choice Award of that year. Mind you, it was very hard to win the Goodreads Choice Awards because we had a lot of Sarah J. Maas being published. Managing to get into the shortlist for finalists, being a story that it's purely adult fantasy, less well known, it was for me a milestone as well. And the second book, which I did not see as much, but I know it's a Booktube darling, and I read it because I was already getting my feet into Booktube and it was recommended, and this is one that starts to come because readers on the internet loved it, was The Shadow of the Gods by John Wayne. This was my first John Wayne story, and although I've later started to read the Faithful and the Broken series, which I think up till now I love a little bit more, I thought the world building was great. Every chapter followed one of these characters, although not necessarily fast, like you couldn't stop reading because you wanted to know more. Every chapter ended on a cliffhanger, In 2022, we have the only author that we will be mentioning twice in this list, and it's at this point with a standalone, which again, I love them, and this one also shares with you this kind of rage feeling, but in this case talks about colonialism, imperialism, and that is Babel by Erin Kwang. Actually won last year the World Fantasy Award, although it was published in 2022, and it's a dark academia story at its finest. It's beautiful how much you can see from it. It's a story that makes you feel smart, but at the same time it is quite slow. You need to take your time, you need to savor it, but the feelings, how it really gets there, it really landed for me. And I loved how, even though we don't have this very rich magic system, nonetheless the feeling and how the depth of this story was created consolidated Erin Kwang for me as one of the main writers. In 2023, and we're getting into something that we can, or at least was very easy for me to remember, we have two stories. In one hand, we have one that was my favorite, and I know that still up to date it's one of the Booktube darlings, and it changed me so much in the sense of I know I love fantasy, but after reading this one, I was like, yes, I want to keep reading, and I recommended this to my husband, to a lot of people, and I'm in awe about how many praise still The Wheel of the Many is getting with the new editions that are absolutely phenomenal. This is a Roman-inspired story that at its core is a little bit similar to Red Rising, if you've read that, which I've kept away from this list because it leans more towards the sci-fi space, but we have here this story of this society that it's broken down in different layers. Magic is really intertwined with the layer in which you're in, and we will be following one of those that will infiltrate in this school. So we also have this martial arts kind of vibe, trying to discover a mystery. I vividly remember reading this, and there are 2-3 scenes that are really impactful and really savage, and the ending of this book, it's really a cliffhanger of epic proportions. Like, I got down the rabbit hole of Reddit for the longest times, and I cannot wait to read this, expecting book 2. We'll see how it goes, but being honest, in 2023 there was another story that was the most popular and the best for a lot of people, and that was Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. And although this is also a military academic setting with dragons, with trials, with love, the impact that Rebecca Yarros has made on the community, it's undeniable, because in 2 years she has been able to sold 12 million copies, and just book 3 of this series, Onyx's Storm, in just 1 week was able to sold 2.7 million copies. So you can see the repercussion. It's one of the highest rated books on Goodreads with more than 2 million ratings, so it's outstanding what we have here. And in 2024 there were 2 books that completely blew the mind of a lot of readers, me included. The source for this one is the video that Vera made, in which she analyzed different Booktube channels, and also the one that I did, in which readers like you share their favorites that are great but less known. First one got into the Goodreads Choice Awards, and I was very pleasantly surprised because I actually really enjoyed this author, and I found this book to be so mesmerizing because it kind of blended things that I did not see before, and we have this hard magic system, but it's very natural, and it's a mystery at its core, a whodunit, but it's a very Attack on Titans kind of inspired, and that was The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. This book really is as good as a lot of readers are saying. I really enjoyed how we are non-stop following these characters from point to point. We have 2 different perspectives blended, and how these 2 characters work together in tandem was really nice to see, because they are weird and they are different. It has a great humor. You have this terrible evil that it's just in the outskirts of this story, so I cannot wait to see how these Leviathans, which is the element that it's more inspired on the Attack on Titans kind of element, comes into the second book. But I was really surprised on how these delivered, both in terms of this was a beautiful mystery to be solved, and also the characters are unforgettable. And then in the other hand, we have one of those books that last year exploded, and this author is getting a lot of popularity lately. I'm hoping this is just the beginning for him and for his series, which I just read the first book and I was pleasantly surprised, although it took me 200 pages to get into the vibe. It's more leaning towards the sci-fi side, but it does have those fantasy elements, and it is Empire of Silence, or the first book in the Sun Eater series by Christopher Rucchio. We follow this character that it's supposed to be the one that kind of destroys planets, and you don't know how that has happened, and it's himself retelling this story, and it has something that it's very compelling in that way of sharing a story, because you know that something bad kind of happens and that he is not like super good, but at the same time you cannot escape the feeling of falling for this main character. And I was thrown from part to part following him, and how he is very humane, and the relationships that he crafts and the feelings, it felt very realistic, which was very weird when you're reading a space opera. And I know this is just the beginning. Different books in the series are getting consistently 5-star ratings from booktubers that I really admire and love. So I guess this is my cue to keep reading, and yours if you haven't started this series yet. I'm leaving you here a video where you can see the books that really change how I read, so hopefully you can blend those also with these ones that are the best or most popular.